On the morning of September 14, 1942, in the quiet coastal town of Falmouth, England, 17-year-old Margaret Peggy Thornton sat at her desk in the cramped back office of the local postal sorting facility, surrounded by canvas bags stuffed with letters and parcels. The autumn fog rolled in from the harbour, muffling the sounds of fishing boats and the distant rumble of military vehicles heading toward the naval base. Peggy had been working as a postal clerk for exactly 3 months, a position she had taken after her father shipped out with the Royal Navy, and her mother needed help paying the rent on their small cottage near the waterfront. What Peggy could not have known that morning, as she sorted through the usual mix of love letters from soldiers, government correspondence and mundane bills, was that her keen eye for patterns and her so-called silly idea would unravel one of the most sophisticated espionage networks operating on British soil. The German intelligence services had spent nearly 2 years building an intricate web of informants along the English coast, and they believed their system was absolutely unbreakable. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a teenage girl's curiosity about unusual postage stamps would ultimately lead to the capture of 11 operatives, the dismantling of an entire intelligence apparatus, and a complete restructuring of how British counterintelligence monitored civilian communications. This is the remarkable true story of how one young woman's attention to detail changed the course of the secret conflict being waged in the shadows of the larger global struggle. Peggy Thornton had always been what her teachers called observant to a fault. Her primary school reports consistently noted her tendency to notice things others missed, whether it was a misspelled word on the blackboard or a pattern in the way birds gathered on the telephone wires outside the classroom window. Her father, Harold Thornton, a career naval petty officer with 22 years of service, had encouraged this trait since she was small, playing observation games with her during his leaves, asking her to memorize details of rooms they visited and recall them later. He called it training her brain to be useful, though he could never have imagined just how useful it would become. The postal sorting facility in Falmouth was a modest operation, employing 12 workers who processed mail for the town and the surrounding villages. The building itself was unremarkable, a 2-story brick structure that had served various commercial purposes over the decades before the Royal Mail took it over in 1928. The sorting room occupied most of the ground floor, with high windows that let in the grey Cornish light, wooden sorting tables arranged in neat rows, and the constant rustle of paper as workers moved letters from bag to slot to bag again. The supervisor, a portly man named Gerald Whitmore, who had worked for the Royal Mail for 31 years, ran the office with a mixture of exhausted routine and wartime anxiety. He had seen 2 major conflicts in his lifetime and knew that every letter that passed through their hands might contain news of a loved one's fate. The weight of that responsibility hung over the sorting room like the ever-present fog outside. Peggy's job was straightforward. She sorted incoming mail by street and village, checked postage for accuracy, and flagged any items that seemed improperly addressed or insufficiently stamped. It was tedious work, the kind that made the hours stretch like taffy, but Peggy found ways to make it interesting. She began noticing the handwriting styles of regular correspondents, could identify certain letter writers by the way they formed their lowercase letters, and even started predicting which envelopes contained good news versus bad, based on subtle cues she could not quite articulate. The weight of the paper, the pressure of the pen strokes, the way addresses were centered or off-kilter, all of these details told stories to Peggy that remained invisible to her colleagues. It was during the second week of September that Peggy first noticed something odd. A letter addressed to a Mrs. Constance Pemberton in the village of Morne Smith bore a stamp that looked slightly wrong. The king's profile seemed fractionally off-center, the perforations along the edge were spaced differently than usual, and the color was perhaps a shade too dark. Peggy held the envelope up to the light from the window, turning it this way and that, trying to identify what exactly was bothering her about it. She said to herself quietly, "That is peculiar." Her colleague at the next sorting station, a middle-aged woman named Dorothy Finch, who had been with the Postal Service for 15 years, glanced over with mild curiosity. Then Dorothy asked, "What have you got there, dear?" Peggy showed her the envelope. She explained that the stamp looked wrong somehow, that she could not quite put her finger on it, but something about it was not right. Dorothy squinted at it for a moment, shrugged, and returned to her own pile. She said that Peggy was imagining things, that all stamps looked the same to her, and that Peggy should just sort it and move on because they had 3 more bags to get through before lunch. Peggy did sort it, but she did not move on. Instead, she made a small note in the margin of her personal notebook, a habit she had developed for tracking interesting observations. She wrote the date, the addressee's name, and a brief description of what had seemed unusual about the stamp. She did not know why she did it. It just felt important somehow. Over the following 2 weeks, Peggy encountered 4 more letters with stamps that triggered the same uneasy feeling. They were addressed to different people in different villages: Mrs. Pemberton in Mornan Smith, a Mr. Howard Green in Penryn, a Miss Adelaide Foster in Myler Bridge, and 2 more to addresses in nearby hamlets. The stamps all shared that same subtle wrongness that she could not quite define. She noted each one in her book, adding details about the return addresses, the handwriting on the envelopes, and the weight of the paper. On the evening of September 28th, Peggy sat at the kitchen table in her family's cottage, her notebook open before her, while her mother prepared a modest dinner of vegetable soup and the last of their week's bread ration. The cottage was small but comfortable, with whitewashed walls and a view of the harbour from the front window. Peggy had lived there her entire life, knew every creak of the floorboards and every draught that slipped through the window frames. Peggy studied her notes, looking for connections between the 5 letters she had flagged. The recipients seemed to have nothing in common. They lived in different villages. Their names suggested no family connection, and the return addresses were scattered across England. Yet something tied them together, something she could almost see but not quite grasp. Her mother, Eleanor Thornton, a practical woman who had worked as a seamstress before the conflict began, and now split her time between the cottage and the local hospital where she volunteered 3 days a week, noticed her daughter's concentration. Eleanor asked what Peggy was puzzling over so intently. Peggy explained about the stamps, about how they all looked slightly off in the same way, about how she could not figure out why but knew something was not right. She expected her mother to dismiss her concerns the way Dorothy had, to tell her she was being fanciful. Instead, Eleanor set down her ladle and came to look at Peggy's notes. She studied them for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Then she said something that changed everything. Eleanor remarked that her own mother, who had been a postmistress in Cornwall for 23 years before the previous conflict, had told her once that during times of tension, intelligence services from various countries sometimes used the postal system to send coded messages. She said that her mother had explained how they would use counterfeit stamps because real stamps could be traced back to specific post offices where they were purchased. Peggy stared at her mother. She asked if her mother was suggesting that these might be counterfeit stamps, that someone might be using them to send secret messages. Eleanor shrugged and returned to her soup. She said she was not suggesting anything, only sharing what her mother had told her years ago. But she added that if Peggy truly thought something was wrong, perhaps she should mention it to someone who might know better. That night, Peggy lay awake in her small bedroom, listening to the distant sound of waves against the harbour wall and thinking about what her mother had said. The idea seemed outlandish, the stuff of adventure novels and cinema serials, but she could not shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something real, something important. The next morning, Peggy arrived at work 30 minutes early. The sorting room was empty except for the night watchman finishing his rounds, and the early autumn light cast long shadows across the sorting tables. She found Gerald Whitmore in his office, reviewing the previous day's sorting reports with his customary expression of mild dyspepsia. When she knocked on his doorframe, he looked up with surprise, as junior clerks rarely sought him out voluntarily. Peggy said good morning and apologized for bothering him. She explained that she had noticed something strange with some of the stamps coming through and asked if he could take a look. Whitmore's first instinct was dismissal. He had worked for the postal service since before Peggy was born, had sorted millions of letters and knew stamps better than he knew his own children's faces. But something in the young woman's earnest expression gave him pause. He gestured for her to come in and show him what she had found. Peggy produced the 5 envelopes she had set aside, having quietly retrieved them from the outgoing mail before they could be delivered. This was technically against regulations, a violation that could cost her her job if discovered. She knew the risk she was taking by admitting what she had done, but she felt the importance of her discovery outweighed the risk. Whitmore examined each envelope in turn, holding the stamps up to his desk lamp, running his thumb across the perforations. His expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity to something that looked almost like alarm. He asked Peggy where she had gotten these, and she explained that they had all come through the regular mail over the past 2 weeks, addressed to different people in different villages. Whitmore was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on his desk. Then he told Peggy to wait in the office while he made a telephone call. He did not tell her who he was calling, but she heard him ask the operator to connect him to a London exchange, and when the call connected, his voice dropped so low she could not make out his words. 20 minutes later, Whitmore returned to find Peggy still waiting nervously in his office. His face had taken on a grim seriousness she had never seen before. He told her that she had done the right thing bringing this to him, that she was to speak of it to no one, not her colleagues, not her friends, not even her mother. He told her that she should return to her normal duties and pretend nothing had happened. He also told her that some people would be coming to speak with her later that day, and that she should answer their questions honestly and completely. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine sorting and mounting anxiety. Peggy could not concentrate on her work, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Had she made a terrible mistake? Would she lose her job? Would she be accused of something herself? The envelopes she sorted seemed to blur together, meaningless rectangles of paper compared to the 5 that now sat somewhere in Mr. Whitmore's office. The people who arrived that afternoon were not what Peggy had expected. She had imagined policemen, perhaps, or military officials in uniform with medals and stern expressions. Instead, 3 individuals in civilian clothes appeared at the sorting facility around 4 o'clock, just as Peggy's shift was ending. There were 2 men and 1 woman, all appearing to be in their 30s, all with the sort of unremarkable faces that seemed designed to be forgotten. The woman introduced herself simply as Miss Crawford. She had brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, wore a tweed suit that could have belonged to any secretary or shopkeeper, and spoke with the crisp accent of the educated classes. She asked Peggy to accompany them to a more private location, where they could discuss her observations in detail. Peggy, her heart pounding, agreed. They drove in silence to a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, a former warehouse that had been converted into offices. The building showed no signs or markings to indicate its purpose. Inside, Peggy was led through a corridor of closed doors to a small room furnished with a table, 4 chairs, and nothing else. The walls were painted institutional green, and the single window was covered with heavy blackout curtains, despite it being only late afternoon. Miss Crawford sat across from Peggy, while the 2 men took positions by the door and window respectively. Their faces remained carefully neutral, giving nothing away. Miss Crawford began by asking Peggy to start from the beginning, to tell them everything she had observed, leaving out no detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Her voice was calm, professional, and completely without judgment. Peggy talked for nearly 2 hours. She described each of the 5 letters, the subtle differences in the stamps, the patterns she had noticed in the addresses and handwriting. She showed them her notebook, which they examined with intense interest, passing it between them and making their own notes. She told them about her conversation with her mother and what her grandmother had said about counterfeit stamps during the previous conflict. She even described her own thought process, the way her mind worked to notice patterns and discrepancies. When she finished, Miss Crawford leaned back in her chair and studied Peggy with an expression that was difficult to read. The room was silent, except for the distant sound of traffic outside. Then she said something that took Peggy completely by surprise. Miss Crawford told Peggy that she had a remarkable gift for observation, that what she had stumbled upon was indeed significant, and that they needed her help to uncover more. Peggy asked what she meant by more, and Miss Crawford explained. The 5 letters Peggy had identified were part of a communication network that British intelligence had been trying to penetrate for months. The counterfeit stamps were produced by a foreign intelligence service and used to mark certain letters for special attention by operatives embedded in the postal system in other parts of the country. By studying the letters Peggy had intercepted, intelligence analysts had already begun to decode the system being used, but they needed more letters, more examples, more data to fully understand the network's structure. And they needed someone with Peggy's unusual ability to spot the subtle differences in the stamps, to help them identify which letters were part of the system. Peggy was stunned. She asked if Miss Crawford was asking her to become some kind of operative, some kind of intelligence agent. The idea seemed absurd. She was 17 years old, a postal clerk, a girl who still lived with her mother and had never been farther from home than Plymouth. Miss Crawford smiled slightly. She said she was not asking Peggy to become a field agent or to take any physical risks. She was simply asking her to continue doing exactly what she had been doing, but more systematically. Miss Crawford explained that they would provide Peggy with magnifying equipment and training in what to look for. Peggy would continue working at the postal facility, continuing her normal duties, but she would also screen all incoming mail for the distinctive counterfeit stamps. Any letters she flagged would be quietly intercepted and analyzed. Peggy asked about the recipients, the people the letters were addressed to. She wanted to know if they were enemy operatives. Miss Crawford's expression grew more serious. She explained that this was what they were trying to determine. Some recipients might be knowing participants in the espionage network, while others might be unwitting intermediaries whose addresses were being used without their knowledge. Miss Crawford told Peggy that her work would help them distinguish between the two. Peggy considered the offer. She thought about her father somewhere at sea, facing dangers she could not imagine. She thought about the conflict that had upended the world, the darkness that seemed to spread further each day. She thought about her mother and their small cottage, and the life she had expected to live before everything changed. Then she agreed. She did not do it for glory or adventure or any romantic notion of espionage. She agreed because she understood that her country was facing a serious threat, that she had been given an opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way. She would have felt ashamed to refuse. Over the following weeks, Peggy received intensive training from Miss Crawford and her colleagues. She learned about the printing techniques used to produce stamps, the various methods of lithography and engraving, the paper stocks and inks used by different postal services around the world. She was shown examples of forgeries from various countries, taught to recognize the telltale signs of different production methods. She learned that even the most skilled forgers could not perfectly replicate the micro-variations in genuine stamps, tiny irregularities in the printing process that were nearly impossible to reproduce. She was provided with a high-quality magnifying glass disguised as a reading aid, the sort an older person with failing eyesight might use, which she kept at her sorting station. She was also given a small ultraviolet lamp that could reveal invisible markings, and a chemical solution that could detect certain types of ink. These tools became extensions of her own senses, enhancing the natural observational abilities that had first drawn attention to her work. She also learned to control her reactions, to appear completely normal even when she spotted something significant. This was perhaps the most difficult part of her training. Peggy's natural instinct when she noticed something interesting was to examine it closely, to turn it over in her hands, to share her discovery with others. She had to learn to suppress these impulses, to glance casually at a suspicious letter, and then set it aside without drawing attention, to wait until the end of her shift to report her findings through the secure channel that had been established. The results were immediate and striking. Within the first month of systematic screening, Peggy identified 23 additional letters bearing the counterfeit stamps. Analysis of these letters revealed a sophisticated coding system hidden in apparently innocent correspondence. The letters discussed mundane topics such as family health, weather, the price of goods, and social gatherings. But certain words and phrases served as signals, conveying information about military movements, shipping schedules, and defensive preparations along the coast. In early November, Peggy made her most significant discovery. A letter addressed to a Mr. Thomas Hartley in the village of Constantine bore not only the distinctive counterfeit stamp, but also a watermark in the paper that she had not seen before. The watermark was barely visible, requiring strong light and careful positioning to detect, but once seen it was unmistakable. a small geometric pattern embedded in the fiber of the paper itself. Peggy reported the watermark through her usual channel, and the response was swift. Miss Crawford arrived in Falmouth the following day, accompanied by additional analysts, and what Peggy sensed was a heightened level of urgency. The watermark, Miss Crawford explained, was a priority marker. It indicated that the letter contained information of particular importance, information that needed to reach its intended recipient quickly and without interference. The discovery of this secondary marking system was a breakthrough, as it would allow intelligence services to distinguish routine communications from high-priority transmissions. But there was more. Analysis of the letter's contents, using the decoding techniques that had been developed from Peggy's earlier discoveries, revealed specific details about upcoming convoy movements in the western approaches. If this information reached enemy hands, the consequences could be severe. Miss Crawford told Peggy that the letter could not be allowed to reach its recipient, but they also could not simply intercept it without alerting the network that their communications had been compromised. A delicate solution was needed. The plan that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. The letter would be delivered as usual, but the envelope would be carefully opened, and the contents would be replaced with modified text that preserved the surface meaning while altering the critical details. The resealed letter would then be delivered to Mr. Thomas Hartley, who would presumably pass the misinformation along to his contacts. Peggy played a crucial role in this operation. She was the one who had to mark the letter for special handling, ensure it was diverted to the intelligence team for modification, and then reintroduce it into the normal mail stream in a way that would not raise suspicion. It required precise timing and steady nerves, both of which she demonstrated admirably. The modified letter was delivered on November 15th. What happened next proved both the effectiveness of the operation and the depth of the espionage network that Peggy had helped uncover. On November 22nd, a convoy departed from a British port, taking a route that differed significantly from the one described in the modified intelligence. An enemy submarine patrol, positioned based on the misinformation that had been fed through the Hartley Channel, found empty ocean where they had expected to encounter merchant vessels. The convoy arrived safely at its destination, and the failed operation confirmed beyond doubt that the intelligence network was active and trusting its communication channels. More importantly, the failed interception allowed British intelligence to track the flow of misinformation backward through the network. By following how quickly the false intelligence reached enemy submarine commanders, analysts were able to estimate the number of intermediaries involved and the likely locations of key operatives. Over the following months, Peggy continued her screening work while a larger investigation unfolded around the leads she had helped generate. She was not privy to all the details, as Miss Crawford maintained strict compartmentalization, but she understood that her discoveries were being used to map the entire network. The culmination came in March of 1943. In a coordinated series of operations across southern England, intelligence services moved simultaneously against 11 individuals identified as participants in the espionage network. The operations were conducted quietly, without public announcement, and the captured operatives were taken to secure locations for interrogation. Among those detained was Thomas Hartley, the recipient of the watermarked letter. He proved to be a British citizen who had been recruited years earlier through ideological sympathy and financial pressure. Under questioning, he revealed the names of his contacts and the methods by which he had received and transmitted information. Also captured was a woman named Ingrid Carlson, who had been living in Britain under a false identity for nearly 3 years. She had posed as a Swedish refugee and worked as a translator for a shipping company, a position that gave her access to information about cargo movements and port activities. She was the one who had been coordinating the distribution of the counterfeit stamps, receiving supplies from abroad and distributing them to the network's couriers. The interrogation of Carlson provided crucial insight into how the counterfeit stamp system had been developed. The stamps were produced at a specialized facility in continental Europe, using sophisticated printing equipment that could replicate official designs with remarkable accuracy. However, the foreign printers had made subtle errors that were invisible to casual observation, but detectable by someone with Peggy's extraordinary visual acuity. The slightly off-center positioning of the royal profile, the marginally different spacing of the perforations, and the fractional variation in ink color were all artifacts of the reproduction process, unavoidable imperfections that Peggy's trained eye had caught. Intelligence analysts later estimated that Peggy's initial observations had accelerated the dismantling of the network by at least 6 months. Without her contribution, the counterfeit stamp system might have continued operating undetected, allowing information to flow to enemy forces and potentially contributing to significant losses. What made Peggy's achievement particularly remarkable was its origin. She had not been trained in counterintelligence, had no background in printing or stamp production, and had no reason to suspect that anything unusual was occurring in her ordinary postal sorting job. Her discovery came purely from an innate talent for observation, combined with the intellectual curiosity to pursue something that seemed not quite right. Miss Crawford later told Peggy that most people, even trained intelligence professionals, would have dismissed the subtle stamp differences as normal manufacturing variation or lighting effects. The human brain, she explained, is remarkably good at normalizing small discrepancies, at seeing what it expects to see rather than what is actually there. Peggy's brain worked differently. She noticed discrepancies rather than normalizing them, questioned rather than assumed, and trusted her own perceptions even when others dismissed them. In the summer of 1943, as the larger conflict continued to evolve, Peggy received an unexpected visitor at her family's cottage. Miss Crawford arrived unannounced on a warm July evening, carrying a small leather case. She explained that she had come to thank Peggy personally for her contribution and to discuss her future. The intelligence services were impressed with her abilities and wanted to offer her a position in a more formal capacity. She would receive proper training, a government salary, and the opportunity to apply her talents to a broader range of challenges. Peggy considered the offer carefully. Part of her was tempted by the prospect of continued involvement, by the sense of purpose and significance that her work had provided. But another part of her recognized that she was still young, that the conflict would not last forever, and that she had other aspirations that had been deferred by circumstances. She thanked Miss Crawford for the offer, but declined. She explained that she wanted to continue her education, perhaps study at university after the conflict ended. She said she had discovered that she loved learning, loved understanding how things worked, and wanted to pursue that in an academic setting rather than an intelligence one. Miss Crawford accepted her decision graciously. She told Peggy that the offer would remain open if she ever changed her mind, and that her contribution would not be forgotten even if it could never be publicly acknowledged. From the leather case, Miss Crawford produced a small medal on a ribbon. She explained that it was an unofficial recognition, not something that could be worn publicly or recorded in official records, but a token of genuine appreciation from those who understood what Peggy had accomplished. The medal was simple bronze, bearing no inscription or national symbol, just a small geometric design that Peggy recognized as similar to the watermark she had discovered in the priority letters. Miss Crawford explained that it was given to only a handful of individuals who had made exceptional contributions to intelligence work. Peggy accepted the medal and kept it hidden in a wooden box at the bottom of her wardrobe, where it remained for the rest of her life. She never spoke publicly about her wartime role, honoring the secrecy that had been requested of her. After the conflict ended, Peggy did pursue her educational ambitions. She enrolled at a university and studied visual perception and cognitive psychology, fields that allowed her to understand scientifically what she had experienced intuitively. Her research focused on individual differences in perceptual ability, exploring why some people noticed details that others missed and whether such abilities could be trained. She earned her doctorate in 1952 and spent the next 4 decades as an academic researcher and teacher. Her work contributed to fields as diverse as quality control in manufacturing, forensic document analysis, and the training of medical diagnosticians who must spot subtle signs of disease in imaging studies. Colleagues who knew Peggy in her later career often remarked on her exceptional observational abilities. She could glance at a research paper and immediately spot typographical errors that others had missed through multiple reviews. She could walk through a laboratory and notice equipment settings that were slightly off. She could look at data and sense patterns that required sophisticated statistical analysis to confirm. When asked about the origin of these abilities, Peggy would smile and say that she had always been that way, that she simply saw what was there to be seen. She never mentioned the postal sorting facility in Falmouth, the counterfeit stamps, or the espionage network she had helped dismantle. The full story of Peggy Thornton's wartime contribution did not emerge until many decades later, when intelligence documents from the era were finally declassified. Researchers piecing together the history of counterintelligence operations discovered references to an unnamed teenage postal worker whose observations had triggered a major investigation. Further archival work identified Peggy and traced her subsequent career. By the time the story became public, Peggy had passed away at the age of 84, having lived a full and productive life. She had married, raised children and grandchildren, and made lasting contributions to her academic field. She had never sought recognition for her wartime service and might have been uncomfortable with the attention it eventually received. But her story resonated with those who learned it, particularly young people who saw in Peggy a model of how ordinary individuals could make extraordinary contributions. She had not been a soldier or a spy or a leader, just an observant teenager with a so-called silly idea that something was not quite right about certain postage stamps. One of her final published papers, written in her 72nd year, included a passage that some readers later interpreted as a veiled reference to her youthful discovery. She wrote that the most important ability any person could develop was the willingness to notice, to really see what was in front of them, rather than what they expected to see. She wrote that society too often rewarded conformity of perception, the agreement to see what everyone else saw, and too rarely valued those who perceived differently. She wrote that a single fresh pair of eyes, unclouded by assumption and expectation, could sometimes see what trained experts missed. She was writing about perceptual psychology, about laboratory experiments and academic theories, but she was also writing about a 17-year-old girl in a foggy coastal town sorting letters in the back room of a postal facility, noticing that certain stamps looked slightly wrong. That girl had trusted her own eyes, had pursued her observations despite dismissal, had spoken up despite uncertainty, and had ultimately helped protect lives and shape the course of history. She had done it not with strategic brilliance or political power, but with attention, with curiosity, and with the courage to say that something seemed not quite right. And that, in the end, is the truest and most important part of Peggy Thornton's remarkable story. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.